Hello, brothers and sisters. I'm Pastor Stephen Gjerde here at Zion Lutheran Church. We also serve Bethany Lutheran Church in Anawa. And I am here to lead us through now our third Bible study on Sunday morning during this time of increased confinement. And what I would like to study with you today is John chapter, well, actually, several chapters in John. So today we're going to be looking at the Gospel of John. And the reason why we're looking at the Gospel of John is because it is the beginning of Holy Week. And the Gospel of John gives us several of our texts that we use during Holy Week. There's a passage from John 12 that is usually read during Holy Week about Jesus saying, "It is my hour." We're going to talk about that shortly. Also in John is where we have the washing of the feet, where Jesus gets down, and this is a stunning moment, where Jesus gets down as a servant on his hands and feet, or on his hands and knees, to wash the feet of his disciples. And then John 2 is often read. The crucifixion scene of John is also read during this time, as well as the resurrection narrative of John is often read on Easter. So John's gospel is, like all of the gospels, something that shows up in our devotion and our piety during Holy Week frequently. And what I would like to talk to you about today is the use of just one word in the Gospel of John. Just one word, and that is the word hour. So if you have your Bibles nearby, go ahead and get one. Either call it up on your phone if you can do that and still watch here on Facebook, or if you have a physical Bible, please open it up to John chapter 2. And I'll give you some time to do that. This is the Gospel of John chapter 2. You do not have to open your Bibles. You can, of course, just listen. I'll be reading things out loud. So John chapter 2. And in John chapter 2, we find what is often called the first miracle of Jesus. Although John does not actually use the word miracle, John more frequently uses the word sign. This is the first sign of Jesus. The idea in John is that there are certain things Jesus did in order to teach who he is, that this is the purpose of the miracles. They are signs that teach who Jesus is. They are signs of the kingdom coming into the world through Jesus. So John chapter 2, we have the first sign. It is the wedding at Cana, and it's significant that it is a wedding, and it's significant that this wedding is the very first place in John where the word hour appears. And when I say hour, I don't mean O-U-R, I mean the measurement of time. H-O-U-R. We're just going to look at that one word and how the word hour, 60 minutes, is used here in the Gospel of John. Again, John chapter 2, I'm going to read aloud, beginning at verse 1. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the wedding with his disciples. When the wine ran out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now there were 6 stone water jars there for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." This is a lot of water, right? And they filled them up to the brim. And he said to them, "Now draw some of it and take it to the master of the feast." So the master of the feast, we don't really have that in the same way, although when we rent like a hall, there's usually someone who's in charge of delivering the meal. That's basically the master of the feast. So they took this water to the master of the feast. When the master of the feast tasted the water, now become wine, and did not know where it came from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the master of the feast called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and when people have drunk freely, then the poor wine, but you have kept the good wine until now." This, the first of his signs, Jesus did at Cana in Galilee, and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and they stayed there a few days. So, a couple things to notice there. As I said earlier, it is in verse 4 that we have Jesus use the word hour. And I think this is the first time that the word hour appears on his lips in John. I'm not sure about that, but it's the first time I'm going to be sharing with you here. Jesus said to her, "Woman, what does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." So what is this hour to which Jesus refers? Well, remember when he first says it, it's in the context of this wedding feast, the wedding at Cana. So Jesus is at a wedding, and he says, "What does this have to do with me? My hour has not yet come." How they may have heard his words then is like this. At that time, today, we think of the bride as being, and her family as being in charge of the wedding feast. But at that time, the groom and his family were in charge of the wedding feast. What the groom would do is he would go through town, through the villages, through the village where he and his bride lived, and he would gather up his bride from her home and then lead her along this big procession, big festival procession, to his father's home, and it is there that they would have the wedding feast. Well, at this wedding feast then, the groom is supposed to be in charge. So when the mother goes to Jesus, not the groom, when the mother of Jesus goes to Jesus and says, "They're all out of wine," and Jesus says, "What does that have to do with me, woman? It's not my hour." It was likely that they may have heard that at that time as Jesus saying, "It's not my wedding day." This is like today when we look at a bride and we say, we don't often say this as often to grooms, I don't think. Maybe we do. "Today is your day. Today is all about you. Today is your day." Well, he's saying, "It's not my hour. It's not my wedding feast. Why are you coming to me? It's not my wedding feast." And that's going to be very significant, because what we're going to find is that throughout the Gospel of John, we're waiting for Jesus' hour. We are waiting for his wedding feast. Where does the wedding feast happen for Jesus? Where does he become the groom? Where does Jesus get his bride? Okay, that's going to be the question. So the very first sign that Jesus does is at the wedding of Cana, at the wedding at Cana. It's at a wedding. Jesus introduces the thought of his hour, that he has an hour. And the other thing to notice is that even at the end of this, there is a comment about time. The timing is off. The master of the feast says most people, they give the good wine first and the poor wine later, because once people have drunk, they're not as picky about what they're drinking, right? I mean, that's the idea. And so now, why are you bringing out this best wine? Here Jesus has now created wine. Of course, it's the best wine. It's a miraculous wine from Jesus' hands. Why are you bringing out the best wine now? There's something about the time that's off. The timing is unexpected. All right? The timing is unexpected. Now, if we go forward from there to John chapter 4, John chapter 4, and actually, I'm going to pause right before John chapter 4, at the end of John chapter 3. I'm going to read a few things there, because as I said, the fact that Jesus' first sign happens at a wedding is significant. And the next time we hear bridal imagery is in John chapter 3. And starting at verse 25 in John 3, we find the following. "Now a discussion arose between some of John's disciples and a Jew over purification. And they came to John and said to him, 'Rabbi, he who was with you across the Jordan, to whom you bore witness, look, he is baptizing, and all are going to you.'" In other words, "John, aren't you jealous? John, aren't you upset that they're going to Jesus now and not to you?" John answered, "A person cannot receive even one thing unless it is given him from heaven. You yourselves bear me witness that I said, I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. The one who has the bride is the bridegroom. The friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly at the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is now complete. He must increase, but I must decrease." So there we see John seem to designate Jesus as the bridegroom. And he also designates who the bride is. The bride are those who are coming out to be with Jesus. The bride are those who are coming to be baptized by Jesus and his disciples. Whether the disciples baptize or Jesus baptize, it's the same thing in a rabbinical situation. Whatever the teachers do or whatever the students do, the teacher is responsible for. Whatever the teacher tells the students to do, that's what they do on his authority. So Jesus is baptizing with his disciples. People are going out to him. And John seems to indicate that those who are believing in Jesus then are the bride. Jesus is the bridegroom. And the fact that he designates himself as the friend of the bridegroom, who says, I'm the one who hears his voice and rejoices, that too refers to the bridal customs of that time. The friend of the bridegroom was like our best man, only his job was not to hang around with the groom and sort of, do whatever groomsmen, best men do today. His job was to, first of all, guard the bride and make sure no one got to her except for the groom. And then the other thing that the best man did at that time was he would sort of help prepare the room for the bridal couple to have on the night of their wedding. And then he would stand and outside the door and sort of keep guard. And so the friend of the bridegroom rejoiced at the voice of the bridegroom in a couple of ways. He rejoiced when he heard the bridegroom coming down the street to fetch the bride, and he also rejoiced when he heard the joy of the marital couple on their wedding night, the voice of the bridegroom. And that's what he's suggesting that he hears now as people are going out and believing in Jesus. That then leads us right into John chapter 4. And in John chapter 4, what we find is the story of the Samaritan woman. Now, Samaria was a land sort of in between where Jesus was born and where Jesus is crucified. So here's Jerusalem here. Jesus is born down by here in Bethlehem, but he's raised up in Nazareth. So Jesus is raised up here in Nazareth. He's crucified down here in Jerusalem. And then Samaria was some of this land here. And Samaria was considered, and actually where Jesus was raised was sometimes considered Samaria, or people who came, he was accused of being a Samaritan in any event. Well, Samaria was populated by people, Jews, who had mixed with other nations, had married people from other nations, and who therefore were the result of a mixed marriage, and who were therefore considered unclean. Notice purification, marriage, that those terms keep arising here. So Jesus now goes to Samaria, this place where there's been mixed marriages, where people are unclean, and he meets a Samaritan woman at a well. That immediately is important because in the Old Testament, it's at a well that everyone goes. That sounds kind of silly, but it's true. They go to the watering hole to find their wife. And so we see that when Isaac needs a wife, Abraham sends his servant to go find Isaac a wife, and his servant finds Isaac a wife by a well. He finds Rebekah. This is in the book of Genesis. And in, I hesitate to say the chapter just offhand, but it's in the late teens. And Rebekah, runs out and she waters the servant's animal, and she gives a drink to the servant. And that's how the servant knows, this is the woman that I want for Isaac. Then later on, Jacob, Isaac's son, goes to the same land, not so much in a search of a wife necessarily, but in search of shelter. And when he comes to a well, there are two sisters. And that's how he meets his future two wives, one who he's tricked into marrying, and then the one he really wanted to marry. And then also Moses. When Moses is running away from the Egyptians, he stops at a well, and it's at the well that he must act to deliver, to save some women from trouble in that area. And that's how he meets, one of the women he saves is his future wife. And so watering holes, the well, sort of become the image in the Israeli imagination, the Jewish imagination. This is where men go to get wives. Now Jesus has just come to a well. And it's a well in Samaria where there's mixed marriages, where people are unclean, all right? And here's what happened. And remember, we're listening for the word "our." Now, when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples. He left Judea and departed again for Galilee, and he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. So Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. It was about the 6th hour. A woman, and that's about noon. So this is about noon where this happens. A woman from Samaria came to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans, those products of a mixed marriage, you know. Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us the well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here to draw water." Now, at this moment, you Christians listening, think to what else happens at the 6th hour, at noon. Is there anyone you can think of who gets thirsty at noon, at the 6th hour, in some other circumstance? Keep that in mind. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband." The issue of marriage arises again. "What you have said is true." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth, for the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, he who is called Christ. When he comes, he will tell us all things." Jesus said to her, I who speak to you am he." He just reveals who he is to this woman, right? And he has said that the hour is here. The hour of what? Is it the wedding hour referred to back at the wedding at Cana? The hour is here. So what does that hour look like? It looks like people worshiping the Father in spirit and truth. It looks like people worshiping the Father through his Son, Jesus Christ. That's the wedding feast. So what happens? Just then his disciples come back. They marveled that he was talking with a woman. Rabbis didn't do that so much. It was dangerous for them. It couldn't leave them unclean if they got in contact with a woman in the wrong way. And so rabbis just avoided women at that time. But no one said, "What do you seek?" or "Why are you talking with her?" So the woman left her water jar, must not be thirsty anymore, and went away into town and said to the people, "Come see a man who told me all that I ever did. Can this be the Christ?" They went out of the town and were coming to him. So there's the wedding feast. There in Samaria, where there's only been unclean marriages, as it's been understood by their neighbors to the south. Now Jesus has come and he's brought a pure marriage, the marriage of faith in him, as he reveals himself to the woman at the well, who runs away no longer thirsty. The hour has come. The hour has come in which she is being satisfied with living waters, the living water of testimony to Jesus Christ. She leaves her water jar behind. She goes away, brings back others who will then, as the passage goes on to say, abide with Jesus, and he abides with them. And they they have a wedding feast of faith. They are united in faith in this new pure marriage. But as we also saw, there's this reference to the 6th hour, to noon, and to thirst. And so then I asked you, can you think of anyone else who thirsted at noon? And I bet you can, right? Well, let's find out. First of all, going forward to John chapter 7, we find, and I'll just kind of touch on a few other instances of where the word hour is used, H-O-U-R, hour, is used in the Gospel of John. So this is John chapter 7, verse 30. So they were seeking to arrest him, but no one laid a hand on him because his hour had not yet come. So he's not suffering yet because his hour, his marriage feast, is not yet fully here. Now, John chapter 8, verse 20. These words he spoke in the treasury. Jesus was teaching in the treasury of the temple, as he taught in the temple, but no one arrested him because his hour had not yet come. Again, they can't touch him. It's not time for him to suffer. So his hour has to do with marriage. It has to do with suffering. It has to do with the cross, with being arrested, with being put into the hands of sinful men. And then we go forward to John chapter 12. And what happens in John chapter 12, beginning at verse 20, is this. John 12, verse 20. Now among those who went up to worship at the feast were some Greeks. So these came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, and asked him, Sir, we wish to see Jesus. Philip went and told Andrew, and Andrew and Philip went and told Jesus. Now, Bethsaida was a city that had a lot of Greeks. So some Greeks, some non-Jews, have come to Philip and said, we want to see Jesus. Philip has a Greek name, so he probably has some Greek ancestry or connections that would have made the Greeks feel comfortable going to Philip. Philip just means horse. And Andrew, well, that's interesting. I had never thought of that until now. Andros means man. And there's actually a psalm that says God does not take any delight in the strength of a horse, or does not take a delight in a horse or in the strength of, or in the legs of a man, the strength of a man. So here we have a horse and a man by their names in Greek going to Jesus and saying to him that there's these Greeks who want to see Jesus. These non-Jews want to see Jesus. Verse 23, and Jesus answered them, the hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Truly, truly, I say to you, unless a grain of wheat falls into the earth and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Whoever loves his life loses it, and whoever hates his life in this world will keep it for eternal life. If anyone serves me, he must follow me, and where I am, there will my servant be also. If anyone serves me, the Father will honor him. The hour has come. The hour has come, verse 23. The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified, because now non-Jews are coming. Now not only have the Jews been hearing the gospel, but now non-Jews have heard the gospel. Now the gospel is beginning to stretch beyond the borders of Israel. Now the hour has come for Jesus to draw the whole world to himself. That's marital language. That's the language of togetherness, abiding together, of union. And so Jesus says, wherever I am, there my servant will be also. Whomever honors me, the Father will honor. There's this family unity now through the gift of faith. So now the hour has come. And it's after this point that we start sort of catapulting in the Gospel of John towards the cross. And so later in the Gospel of John, actually right before that, Jesus has already just entered Jerusalem as we celebrate today on Palm Sunday. So now we're in Jerusalem, and later on, Jesus starts having the Last Supper in John chapter 13. And two other passages I want to share with you, and then we'll conclude for today. During the Last Supper, that night before, the night in which he was betrayed, Jesus says the following in John chapter 14. We often read it at funerals, and it's very meaningful at a funeral. And then what we want to do today is unpack it even more in light of this hour of marriage that has now arrived. Jesus says the following, John 14, verse 1. Let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God. Believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. If it were not so, would I have told you that I go to prepare a place for you? And if I go and prepare a place for you, I will come again and will take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. And you know the way to where I am going. And then that's where Jesus goes on to say, I am the way, the truth, and the life. But let's pay attention to that language. We often interpret that language in terms of the world to come. Jesus goes and prepares a place for us, and that's true. Jesus goes and prepares a new creation for us by dying and rising again, and then ascending to the Father and ruling with the Father in his power and might. But this language of preparing a place for you, this is again marital language. What does the groom do in ancient Judea? He goes after he secures the engagement, which was very contractual then. Once he forges the contract of engagement, he goes and prepares a place for the bride in his father's house, which is where the wedding feast will take place and where he and his bride will have their first night together in the Father's house. So now Jesus, at a feast with his disciples, the Last Supper, says, I go and prepare a place for you, and I will take you to myself. Here he's not talking about, of course, marriage as we think of it today, the union of husband and wife, but he's using that imagery to talk about the union of faith. I go and prepare a place for you in my Father's house, in the Father's grace and mercy, in the Father's new creation, in the Father's kingdom already now on earth. There will be room for you because I, Jesus, go and prepare a place for you like a groom does so for his bride. And then we go from chapter 14. There's other things we could be looking at, but for the sake of brevity and making the point, we then go to chapter 19 in the Gospel of John. We go to verse 12. And if you were listening to the broadcast today, you already heard a little bit about this. But remember that when Jesus went to see the Samaritan woman, or when he happened to see the Samaritan woman, it was the 6th hour. It was noon. Beginning at verse 12 in chapter 19, from then on, Pilate sought to release Jesus, but the Jews cried out, if you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar's. Everyone who makes himself a king opposes Caesar. So when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Stone Pavement, and in Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about the 6th hour. He said to the Jews, behold your king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but Caesar. So he delivered him over to them to be crucified. At noon, at the hour when he sees the Samaritan woman, the same hour, and she is thirsty and he is thirsty, this is the same hour at which he is now crucified. And of course, we also know it is the same hour where Jesus says, verse 28 in chapter 19, after this, or 3 hours later, after this, Jesus, knowing that all was now finished, said to fulfill the scripture, I thirst. A jar full of sour wine stood there, so they put a sponge full of the sour wine on a hyssop branch and held it to his mouth. When Jesus had received the sour wine, when he finally got his drink, the bitter cup of suffering, he said, it is finished, and he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. So he didn't get his drink at the well, because remember, the Samaritan woman gets so excited that she now knows the Christ. She runs out and gets other people to come know the Christ. She leaves her jar behind. Jesus never gets a drink of water, at least in that scene, in that instance. But she did. She got the living waters. And now Jesus, who is the source of living water, who's pouring himself out so that others may be, those who thirst for righteousness may be satisfied. Now he at last receives the drink he was looking for, the sour drink, the bitter drink of suffering. And it's in that moment then that Jesus is dead, that Jesus dies, that he is wedded, he is married. And it's really in every moment leading up to this, of course, but this is the sort of consummation that Jesus is wedded and married to the human race, because he has now been given over to our death. He has died our death. What we suffer daily, he now has tasted and experienced and drunk. And so he truly is ours. And he is where we are at. he is with us in the grave. And yet, because Jesus is with us in the grave, he's the way, the truth, and the life. Life is with us in the grave. Resurrection is coming. Jesus will rise, and having now so united himself with us in that death, he promises we shall be united with him also through baptism into his death with the resurrection, so that we may rise with him. This is the marriage feast to which you belong, dear brother and sister Christians. And so share the good news. Invite others to the wedding feast. It's going on every day because Christ is risen. He is always the one who has died for you. And now he lives and rules in mercy and reconciliation for you and for the whole creation. May God's peace be with you.